like to get my my face out there as much as possible. Um, I had a little mishap on my analytics account Twitter today.
Oh
So,
no.
but it's all good. We're just gonna keep going.
All
I had a
right.
Minnesota Vikings fan call me a very derogatory
Ooh.
name that women do not like to be called.
All right.
So
Well,
we'll just
you know
leave it at
what?
that.
It's the internet.
Yeah.
The internet. But as I mentioned before, you were on night 1. Were you on night 2?
Yes, yes, sir. I
Okay,
was.
so yeah, so you were on night 2. So we covered for those of you who are not aware, we covered rounds 1 through 3. We ended up covering round 3 of the NFL draft, and we had on so many people, literally so many people, that we were turning guests away or making them wait in a queue because we didn't realize that you can only have 10 people on a screen at a time and 12 people uh, in the studio is what this is called on StreamYard. So we appreciate everybody that tuned in to watch it. That was the first thing we were going to talk about, is because that's the majority of what the show is. It's the majority of what all the shows have been so far this week, because we're obviously in the week post NFL draft. And what an NFL draft it was. The picks came in faster than ever. Teams, especially in the AFC, that were already so packed from free agency and re-signing guys and trading and signing guys in this offseason, brought in even more, and that's going to be one of our discussions here in a little bit. But again, if for some reason you want to go back and watch the draft, you can find coverage of nights 1 and 2 on Buffalo Fanbase. If not, just completely forget about it and just stay here, and we're gonna talk about the NFL draft. So we're gonna actually run through all of the Buffalo Bills draft picks, and then we're gonna talk about the undrafted free agents, because it is undrafted free agent season, and there was a run on those who were not drafted. So, Charlie, to start it off, we're going to talk about, obviously going in order. Round 1, pick 23. The corner that nobody really saw going off the board before a lot of the other corners that were out there, specifically Andrew Booth Jr., who then had to wait a little bit. But the Bills trade up from 25 to pick 23 to take Kaiir Elam at corner. Again, they trade up from 25 to 23. And there was a little bit of some, I don't know if you want to call it misinformation or whatnot, going out there on draft night, where some of the conversation was towards like, well, again, it was an unexpected pick for anybody, let alone Bills fans, but it was a bit of an unexpected pick. So we didn't really know, but a lot of the conversation was about, oh, he has some inconsistencies with tackling. He's not really that fast, blah, blah, blah. Turns out he's a little bit faster than was kind of being touted. And he does have he has a unique style of tackling, but he is very aggressive for a corner, especially a corner coming into the Bills organization, when we know that they really prefer people who are not really that athletic, but have certain traits that they're really looking for. So before we get into the bigger question revolving around corners, what is your take? Either if it's different from when we first took it, or if it's changed, what was your take on the Bills taking Kaiir Elam at 23, trading up to get him again, versus now, or if it's the same? Basically, what's your take on Kaiir Elam?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same. I was fine with it. I didn't hate it. I didn't, like I think I said, I was on with Justice yesterday. I don't even remember. Yesterday maybe, and I didn't jump about my chair and start screaming, let's go, or anything either. And that's no reflection really on Kaiir Elam. I think we go through these things in draft season, right? Where Brandon Bean is pretty honest, and we can identify needs ourselves, right? So we kind of look at it and we go, oh, they need a corner. Well, they're not going to take a corner. They never take a corner. They don't want to take a corner. And then it's sort of like, well, Trey White's injured, so they have to take a corner. And they love, so it became this thing.
That bona fide number 2. And again, we're going to talk about Dane Jackson and Cam Lewis here in a minute, but their bona fide depth can start a couple of games. Again, Dane really stepped up while Trey was out this past year. And so I want to talk about that, though, just for a second, because a lot of people, because Dane Jackson stepped up, was like, oh, he could potentially compete for this number 2 spot and take it. We out and potentially fill in, the number 1 while Trey is still out. I don't know if we officially know what the timeline is for Trey to come back. I think it's somewhere in the late fall, October to November. But now we have Kyer Elam. Obviously, again, you're not going to have Trey for until
I think, and I know we'll maybe talk about this guy more later, but I think there's 2 corners from this draft that are going to make the roster. Um,
Ooh,
so
okay.
I think you're going to look at, those 2 guys plus Trey if he's healthy, at least to start the season. And then you got Teron Johnson, and you've got, Saron Neal is technically like a corner, right? And then
Yeah,
you've got Dane Jackson. Yeah, I think Dane is definitely more physical. Obviously not as athletic as Trey White, but definitely more physical. And I think Elam is along that vein, but he's obviously more athletic than Dane Jackson. So,
yeah.
um, I think Dane Jackson. I think he started 6 games total, 8 games total in the regular season. Anyway, and then obviously a couple playoff games. So, I
Mhm.
think he's. I don't want to say he's a roster lock because I think that's a bit rich, but I'd be very surprised if he didn't make the roster. And I think having, I think it just comes down to who can you get on the practice squad too at some point. Like I feel like you
Right.
can get, Lewis onto the practice squad, and I don't know if you can get the other guy we'll talk about later onto the practice squad. So and not that I'm saying that should be the only reason why you keep a guy, but it has to
Right.
be a factor for these teams. Like you don't want to lose a guy you picked him for a reason, even if it's like a 6th
Yeah.
round guy. So you try not to lose those guys. So I think Cam Lewis will be on the practice. I think you'll see a lot of the same cast of characters on the practice squad this year, to be honest, as you did last year.
Okay. Okay. Um. Well, so I think the man that you're alluding to is pick 185 Christian Benford, at corner, and a lot of people have had a lot of good things to say about him. But I also wanted to throw another name out there. The Bills did sign a corner through undrafted free agency, and that's corner Trayvon Fuller from Tulsa. So that's another name to add into the mix. Granted, he is an undrafted free agent, but we also know how successful this team is at finding undrafted free agents who can win starting spots away from bona fide veterans. But moving on so that we can talk about guys like Trayvon Fuller and Christian Benford. The Bills ended up trading back 6 picks to get this guy. Delvin Cook's younger brother at pick 63, James Cook at running back. So I had personally, I had Cook as the Bills pick at 89 in the third. Now, obviously, knowing now with hindsight how the draft fell, he probably most definitely was not going to make it to 89. I mean, this whole draft was completely, again, we saw at the beginning, the intro video, the whole draft was completely screwed up this year. But the Bills traded back 6 because they were confident they could still get James Cook at pick 63. We know that he can help us in the passing game. We know that he's a bona fide, legit running back talent. Again, he's Delvin Cook's younger brother, but he also works out not just with Delvin Cook, but with Singletary in Florida in the offseason, has been and is continuing to be. So when we traded back 6 to grab James Cook, what was your reaction? Because there were some there were some great names at running back, like Isaiah Spiller, I believe, was still on the board, and the Bills took James Cook. So, what are your thoughts on the James Cook pick?
Yeah, it's weird for me. First of all, yeah, like definitely a weird draft, as you did mention earlier. The picks, man, I can't remember a year where the picks were coming through like this fast. It was, I was like, wait a minute, we're not even done talking about this. The
Yeah.
one pick,
Well,
and
I know, like the Lions. Something came out. I don't know if you saw this, but the Lions were like for the second year in a row, the NFL like came back and yelled at us, basically saying you handed in the picks too early. Like they wanted more time because we know we talked about before night one of the NFL draft is
right,
very drama, but they literally went back to Detroit and they were like, no, 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 you
yeah. Can
turned
you
in
just
the
take
picks
the full
too
10 minutes?
early.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I was sort of indifferent, I guess, about the James Cook pick when it first happened, and it's it's grown on me a little bit, I guess, because I think that it's the things that they might be able to do are interesting. Because I was thinking, okay, well, what if they have, um, Diggs and Davis, Knox and Howard and James Cook, and then all of a sudden you're really dealing with like a five wide set. When they put them out wide, things like that. I think some people have gotten, and I don't necessarily mean Bills fans. I was talking to some fantasy football guy on Twitter today, and he's like, "Oh, James Cook's gonna get 25 touches." I'm like, "You're crazy!" Like, no, he's not. He's gonna get like 8 touches. Like Singletary is still the guy. Like they're not like James Cook isn't gonna like run between the tackles that well. Like Singletary is still the guy. So I think it's almost like a luxury pick. And obviously, we knew they wanted this because they've been looking. They got Duke Johnson. They tried to get McKissick. So they want this part of their offense. To me, I just felt like I'd rather have a wide receiver, but he kind of is like a quasi wide receiver in a way. And I don't want to be too disingenuous because I have been one of the people who's been sort of screaming for more speed at some point somewhere in the offense, like where can we get a guy who are people are afraid of, like the same way we seem to be afraid of like Tyreek Hill. So I mean, I guess another pick where I'm fine with it. I wasn't, some people were like super stoked. Like I was just kind of like, yeah, cool. Um, so I'm fine with it. Like if it helps the Buffalo Bills win football games and hopefully win a Super Bowl at some point, then I'm fine with it.
Yeah. And to your point, I mean, they not only add a little bit of speed in Cook, but they also add a guy that can help out uh in the passing game as well. And of course, uh, we're gonna talk about a wide receiver with speed here in a little bit because I did end up adding one. Some would say a pretty good steal at where we grabbed him, but you kind of alluded to this before. The question with James Cook coming in at, I mean, such a su- such an almost important part of the draft, right? I mean, he's a second round pick, but um, what does this mean for Singletary, Moss, and Johnson? And I think you touched on it really well. This really means little for Singletary, in terms of the fact that he's the guy. It might have postseason, like after this year, it might definitely
Sure.
come down to it because he's in the final year of his contract. So it's definitely, it might have some after the season uh impacts there. I think it's really coming down specifically to Moss, maybe Johnson, but I think Moss a little bit more because Johnson's more of a camp body. He's a veteran. He's 27 years old. He's been around the league a little bit. He's bounced from or between a couple of different teams. So it really comes down to Moss. And so my question to you is, with James Cook, with the addition of James Cook and the 4 something years, right? The 3 to 4 years that we have him on this rookie contract, is there a risk that he's going to take Singletary's job in this next year? But is it really more a risk for Zach Moss? Like, could Moss not make the roster this year even? Like, is there a potential? Do you see any potential fantasy world in which Cook and Johnson potentially beat out Moss and Moss is shipped out?
I think it's definitely possible. I think the one thing going for Zach Moss, aside from the fact that he's a draft pick and they like to keep their draft picks, is that he's kind of like the only guy who you would really describe as a like a banger, right, between the tackles. Like Singletary can do that, and he has tried to step into that role, and certainly in those last 3 or 4 regular season games, or maybe it was against the Patriots, he had one of those runs where he's bouncing off people in between the tackles, and so he can do it. But I feel like the mission this year for the Bills in a way was to try to take more things away from Josh Allen in terms of what he has to do in terms of contact with other football players. And so Zach Moss is kind of the only guy on the Bills who can take away those like goal line touches from Josh Allen. And I'm not sure like it's the best idea to take those away, but the team seems to want to take some of those away. So, Duke Johnson is more similar to James Cook than he is to Zach Moss, but certainly Zach Moss with his, fumbling issues and his ineffectiveness from last year, he's by no means, I don't think, a roster lock. And then going forward with Singletary, to me, that's fascinating because the Bills have not spent. You can say they spent sort of decent assets with the third round picks, but they have not spent any money at that position. It's like 2% of the salary cap, like 3% of the salary cap. So, and not that Singletary is going to break the bank, 5-6 million a year, maybe, but this is going to be a real test, I think, for Brandon Beane's philosophy of draft, and re-sign, because running backs, you can kind of just get them whenever. So they don't want, one guy, they want a committee. So is that Singletary and Cook going forward, or is that Cook and Moss going forward? Is it Cook and a guy that they draft next year going forward? It's hard to know that, because I think with all the other positions, it makes sense to re-sign your own guy. But running back just seems to be one of those spots where the NFL almost exclusively like just doesn't value it that much, and it's just kind of almost easier to just draft a guy. So it's going to be a really big insight, I think, into Sean McDermott, Ken Dorsey, and Brandon Beane this offseason to see if Singletary does get that contract extension, or if they just say, hey, thanks, man, appreciate it, we'll just draft another guy in the third or fourth round.
Yeah, and I mean, we know from McDermott's comments after the season ended this past year that he wants, he alluded to the fact that it's a running back, but he wants Josh to stop running. And I'll admit, I was along the lines of people that wanted Josh to stop running, not because he's not good at it, but it's like, I need my quarterback to be healthy if we're going to go compete for a Super Bowl. And if not, already in there, win one. And so I need him kind of standing upright. And so McDermott, I think, heard that, saw that, clearly was a little bit tired of that, because he, came right out and said, hey, I want my, my running, or my quarterback to stop being a running back and to stop running. So, we'll see what happens. But again, to your point, before we move on to pick number 89, is you're right. The NFL does not value running backs today like it has in the past. And that's just because the virtue of it is this is now a passing NFL, offense. This is the era that we live in, not just passing, but also the era of the mobile quarterback. There's no really there's a couple of pocket passers that are still around. Tom Brady being, one of them. I think probably the only one off the top of my head that is really starting. But I don't know. It's going to be difficult because, we know what Singletary can do from his rookie year, and we think we know what James Cook can do, and we know what Zach Moss can't do. So it's definitely going to be interesting. But talking about interesting, pick 89, again, once more, a name that nobody expected to come up, and a lot of people went, I've never heard of this guy. I mean, because we literally said it on the live on the show. We're like,
yeah, like who?
Never heard of this guy before. But then afterwards, it comes out that the Jets were supposedly really into him, and they were going to take him. Was it like 11 or 12 picks later after the Bills? Like if he was there, they would have taken him. Some other teams really fell in love with the idea of Terrell Bernard at linebacker, but his draft, grading isn't great. It has him as like an average backup to special teams guy. And so this is a really, I think, important but chaotically weird pick, because a lot of fans talked about replacing Tremaine Edmonds or finding somebody that can take over for Tremaine Edmonds if he doesn't work out this year, again, in their eyes. And we take a linebacker in the third round at pick 89, who nobody's really ever heard of, who is an average backup to special teams guy. No doubt the intent is to have him replace some of the special teams guys that we lost this offseason. But again, our reaction and a lot of fans' reactions is, who the heck is this guy? So now a week or so later, who is this guy?
Well, yeah, and I've sort of been trying to get as much information as I can as well. And I think the thing that I'm left with is that he's sort of, I mean, he's 6'1", like 220, so you sort of conjure up the images of Matt Milano, but I feel like too he's got a little bit of like Lorenzo Alexander in him in a way. I mean, he's a guy who is a good tackler. He did well in coverage. He did well kind of blitzing. Like he's kind of this like guy who's got this all around skill set. So I think it's a great compliment to Milano and Edmonds, and I don't know if he can. I don't know if he can step in and do what Edmonds does in terms of coverage, partially because Edmonds is just so tall and has such a big wingspan.
Right.
And I think that matters. And if you're 6'1", 220, you're not 6'5", 255. There's just a difference there in terms of arm length. But he certainly seems more instinctive in the sort of pass rushing, filling the gaps area. So it's going to be real interesting to see exactly why they wanted him, how they're going to implement him. And, some people have compared this to Carolina when they had Shaq Thompson, or they actually still do have Shaq Thompson, but when McDermott was there, they had him as well. And how they used him, and maybe they're going to take Teron Johnson off the field a little more often in running plays, even though I think he's a really good run defender. So this guy is one of the guys that actually really, really excites me. There's really three picks that I found once I did more research really excited me. It's this pick, and then it's this guy we've sort of talked about already, and then Caughill Shakur, who we're going to talk about I think next.
Yes,
But
next.
these three guys have really kind of. I'm really excited with what they can do, because I think they bring something a little different or a little more versatile that maybe the Bills don't have. So I'm excited to see how they implement these players.
All right. Well, listen, I like it. Again, because on the surface level, like I said, he feels like a replacement for Klein on special teams. Like that's what, if you look at just the surface of it, it feels like, because he's an average backup to special teamer. He's a linebacker. Like you said, he's built like Milano, and Milano and Klein were fairly similar, but that's what it feels like on the surface. But I really like, and I really do appreciate your analysis, your in-depth analysis there on Terrell Bernard. Terrell Bernard at linebacker at pick 89. And you just mentioned his name, so we'll go right into him, talking about him right now. But at pick 148, the Bills took wide receiver Caughill Shakur, who a lot of people, including some at Buffalo fan base and in our stream on night one, we're night one and during round two, we're very much like, hey, why is this, like, if this guy's on the board, let's take him. If this guy's on the board, let's take him. And every round it was, if this guy's on the board, let's take him. And they somehow get him at pick 148. Now the wide receiver situation for the Bills is one that I think has not been this deep in a long time. Obviously, we lost a couple of guys this offseason. We did not, or have not yet, chosen to re-sign Emmanuel Sanders. I don't have any indication. I haven't seen any indication that they intend to, besides one report of, hey, UDFA is over pretty much. It's time usually for some veterans to get signed. We know Tyrann Mathieu just signed with New Orleans. But this is a rather deep wide receiver core that this team has not seen in a long time. They signed Jamison Crowder in the offseason. They draft Marquez Stevenson last year. We obviously know that they have Gabe Davis, Stephon Diggs. They re-signed Isaiah McKenzie. So this is a very deep wide receiver group. And then again, at pick 148, they add Caughill Shakur. Now, there's obviously the fact that he is a really good bona fide returner, which we know was a massive issue last year when you saw returning duties split between Stevenson and McKenzie up until the point Micah Hyde even had to return. And even then, it was a little bit better, but it still wasn't great because A, you don't want to see a guy like Micah Hyde playing that position, especially that late into the season and into the playoffs. And two, it just was a horrible, horrible year for the Bills return game. So at 148 with Khalil Shakir, is he purely here just because he's a pick of necessity? Hey, we needed a returner. Clearly, the guys on our team, like a guy like McKenzie, possibly Stevenson, are going to be competing or participating, splitting duties with a guy like Jamison Crowder in the utility and slot game? Or is it, hey, Khalil Shakir can return, but he's also a pretty dang good wide receiver. We want him to compete with some of these guys, and we might actually see the wide receiver group thin out a little bit by the time the season starts.
Yeah, well, I think they had to get a returner. Well, whatever they were trying to do last year, it obviously didn't work. And I think Stevenson is. I think they should keep 7 wide receivers. They never do. So I guess the solution has to be that one guy can return punts and kicks. And so far, Stevenson has proven that he cannot return punts. He's okay at kicks. And McKenzie, I think, proved that he's not a real option either. So it's really Shakir's job to lose. I know he's certainly got experience with punts. I don't know if he's got experience with kicks. It didn't seem that way. So that's something he'll have to learn. But I think he becomes the heir apparent to the slot position as well. Crowder's here on a 1-year deal. And obviously the Bills aren't going to say that. They're going to have a competition, obviously, like they always do. But I really think that he's going to make the roster. I think Stevenson probably isn't, although I would prefer that they keep him if he's the best kick return option. And then you've got Hodgins, who, people like Hodgins, but the guy hasn't stepped on the field in the regular season ever. So, there at some point you get into the depth of the wide receiver room as a depth of potential, and I don't know how much that really accounts for anything. So I expect it to be Diggs, Davis, McKenzie, Crowder, Kumaro, and then I think the battle comes down to Shakir or Stevenson or maybe both make it. And then sure, you've got your ancillary guys like Tanner Gentry. And I know there's a few other guys, but I really think that it's just Shakir is gonna make the roster. They're gonna keep 6 guys, and they've got to get the punting situation and the return situation figured out, because it's almost like they had this like arrogance, and I like the coaching staff. They're like, yeah, we're not gonna punt ever. Like, yeah, you are. Like, what are you talking about? Like, of course you're gonna punt. And they're just like, nah, yeah, we're fine. We're gonna score 9 million touchdowns. Like, come on. Like, so I'm glad that they addressed both of those concerns, because I'm not gonna say that was like the reason that the season ended or anything, but there were probably games where that mattered, where they could have had better return game, better punting game, and maybe it would have made a difference, and maybe those 13 seconds wouldn't have even mattered because they would have had home field advantage. Who knows? I'm not, I can't recall every moment of every game right now, obviously, but it mattered a little bit.
No, and you're absolutely correct. Again, when you get to reiterating my point from earlier, when you get to the point where Micah Hyde, not only just a veteran player, but a really big, important piece of our defense, who's missing other really big, important pieces of it in Trey White, you don't want to take away from that. And you were forced to go down to like the last minute, like unless like Josh Allen is going to go back there and start returning punts, like that's pretty much the point where you were at, right? Like the next step is like, all right, let's see what Josh has. So
I mean,
you never know. You never know, right?
Pretty good in the open field. I'm just
saying. Right. So I mean, you never know. It's definitely going to be interesting. I mean, personally, I'm a fan of Isaiah Hodgins, but you are right. He has not touched the feet. He was called up this past year, though. He was called up off the practice squad. I don't believe he was on the field at all, but he was called up and was active. He was on the 53. And really, I'm interested. Like, he's my guy to look at heading into this preseason, because he's such an interesting story. Like, we've seen what Gabe Davis can do, but he's supposed to be like, he was the guy that was supposed to be over Davis coming out of camp. He's a red
Yeah.
zone wide receiver threat, which we don't really have like a red zone wide receiver threat. We have guys that can make catches just outside the red zone, get into it, and make something happen. And we obviously talked before about how Zach Moss really hasn't assisted us in the red zone either at all. So it'll be interesting to see if he can compete. And we obviously know injuries followed by the fact that Emmanuel Sanders, knocked a bunch of guys down at multiple positions in the depth chart and on the roster. So without a guy like Sanders on the offense, I'm hopeful that a guy like Isaiah Hodgins will make it. But again, to your point, we won't know until we know. And so talking about pick 148, Khalil Shakir at wide receiver, we won't know till we know, we may have found a solution at return. But you also mentioned a solution to our punting woes this last season, where Matt Hawk, who was pretty dang good in Miami, was not that good in Buffalo. And so after Jordan Stout from Penn State goes off the board, the Bills swoop in and take Matt Araiza at punter at pick 180, which was an insane, like, it feels like a massive jump has been made in terms of teams regarding special teams as like a very important part of the football game. And that may just
Yeah.
be because more and more now we're seeing that teams are so jam-packed full of talent, and they're realizing like, hey, we're getting screwed over on special teams. But to take a punter at pick 180, and obviously Stout going off the board way before this, is pretty significant, not just for the NFL, but obviously in this case for the Bills. So this guy, his nickname's the Punt God. He's the punting version of Tyler Bass, pretty much, is what he's being touted as, where he's going to come in, solve all of our issues. Well, Charlie, my question for you is the Punt God at pick 180 going to come in and solve our punting issues?
I sure hope so. I mean, it's hard. It's hard not to, right? Like, you can't really be worse than Matt Hawk was last year. It would be like, you, even if you tried to be that bad, I don't think you could. Like, so the question really is how is he going to be as a holder? And obviously there's a transition to the NFL, right? Like any position, long snapping, punting, there's a transition to the NFL. Things are different. So we'll see how he handles the pressure, those types of things. But I feel like he gives you everything he has the potential to give you everything you want in a punter. He has lots of hang time. He has lots of distance. He's pretty good at directional punting. The key for them, which they, emphasized too much last year, was the holding. And I'm assuming that you can learn that. Like, people learn how to do that. So we'll see. But if he doesn't beat out Matt Hawk, either two things: either the Bills have no clue what they're doing on that position on the roster, or he's terrible. Because you can't go with that bad of punting that Matt Hawk gave you. You just can't. Like we just talked about, it had to have at least cost them a game at some point, or came close to costing them a game. And they're the favorites in a lot of ways to win the Super Bowl, whether it's this year, next year, hopefully for the next 12, 14 years, they're going to be competitive and they're going to be a contender. And while that sounds like a lot of time, you can't have special teams and the guy who's shanking the ball for 15 yards messing that up. There's so many things that can go wrong. Like, let's find a guy and let's just develop them, and let's just get going and not have to worry about that for 20 years. Like, come on. And yeah, he's
Right.
a good athlete. Like, he could play backup quarterback probably.
Right. And so you had mentioned it at the very beginning of that, like, or you had made a comment. Oh, he can learn, you can learn how to hold a ball. And one of my favorite stories is outlines that exactly. And it comes from Pat McAfee. And when he got drafted by the Colts, Bill Polian asked him if he could hold. And he said yes. And then he says, he follows that up with, that was a lie. I had no idea. He
Right.
lied and said he had held in college and he didn't. And so when he got to training camp and Adam Vinatieri said, basically like, you're not going to screw this up. Can you hold? And he went, I can't. I don't know how to. So he's like, Vinatieri went, you're not going to screw this up for me. And he sent him to, Pat describes it as like a holding, a football holding boot camp, where that's what he did for like a month. Was he went to this guy's house that Vinatieri sent him to, and he learned how to hold the football. And really at the end of the day, so obviously it's a teachable, learnable skill, the basics. But at the end of the day, there are, kickers like their balls held a certain way and at a certain angle and a degree. And there's so much science that goes into it. And so that's why it sucks when you lose. And so like Pat said, when he was with Indy and Vinatieri was out, he had to learn how to hold the ball a different way. So there's a little bit of complication to it, but learning the basics of how to do it is certainly teachable. It clearly is. One of the greatest punters and possibly holders of all time says that it is, because he learned it. So it definitely is. And you're right. It was an excuse that was used way too much last year as well. He's really good at holding the football. Well, if I go turn on Madden right now, I guarantee you the default holder is going to be whoever my QB2 is on the depth chart. So, there's multiple positions that could learn how to hold the football. And that's an excuse that was used way too much last year, and hopefully is not used going forward. And I don't think it will be, because we picked a punter at 180. But there was a guy that we had talked about before. You've alluded to, I think, like 4 times now. We're finally here. At pick 185, the Bills took, and again, this is another one of those like, hey, this is a really good grab at this position. Just 5 after taking Matt Araiza. The Bills went ahead at 185 and grabbed Christian Benford at corner. So I know you've been chomping at the bit to get to him. So why do you think that Christian Benford is potentially starting or on the 53 man this year?
Well, I think he's obviously very intelligent, and I think he was sort of devalued because he played at Villanova. I think, I know Eric Turner from Cover One has put out a few videos of Benford playing zone. And the one thing that really stuck with me, and obviously zone is more or less what it sounds like. You're covering an area, and and then when the person comes into your area, you sort of have to man them up. I think Eric Turner said if you watch Benford play zone, he's never covering grass. And it sounds simple to be like, well, he's just going to drop back 10 yards and stand here. And if a guy comes, but there's a lot of nuance in that. And so to get a guy like that, I think he's pretty strong on the ball. He's physical. Like I said, he's obviously extremely intelligent. I mean, what's really not to like, right? And he's a guy who maybe you can flex a little bit to safety even. And maybe this guy is a solution for, at some point, Hyde and Poyer aren't going to be here. And I don't think it's a guarantee that Hamlin or Johnson just take over. They might be nothing but backups. So who knows? You get this guy in your system, let him learn the system, let him use his intelligence, let him use his strength, and see where things end up. I just think it's like this thing where this guy has a lot of versatility and a lot of upside, and people are like, well, he went to Villanova. It's like, well, who cares? Like, I think that's overvalued. And so I think just the Bills got to steal. And if this guy had gone to, Notre Dame, he'd be a 3rd or 4th round pick.
Right. And that's like, and I totally agree. Cause for me, again, I don't watch that much college football. When I do, it's watching the Navy team. Obviously, of course, the Army Navy game, but like so many guys I've seen come out of Navy, and I've watched them play for, the 4 years that they're there. And I see them and I go like, oh, like the Bills, like this year, like Diego Fajot, who was, the team captain at Navy 4 years there. He's a heck of a leader. and he provided a lot at linebacker. He was even like an emergency center at times on the Navy team. I thought he was a really good grab, and I had the Bills in a mock draft taking him at 7. He ends up going undrafted and signs with Baltimore. And there's tons of examples of that. Keenan Reynolds, who was probably one of the best quarterbacks, if not the best quarterback, not just in the modern era, but I would say since Roger Staubach at the Naval Academy, breaking tons of his records, and he goes undrafted, is drafted by Baltimore again, gets converted into a wide receiver, and within a few years, he's out of the league. They repeat the same story. Malcolm Perry, great quarterback at Navy, I think goes undrafted, signs with either the Patriots or the Dolphins. He bounces between teams, and I think he's a wide receiver on the practice squad with the Dolphins. Like there's so many guys from these smaller schools that teams don't really consider, or they undervalue, or they're, like you said, they're devalued because of that. So I absolutely agree. And I put this up before, but we're going to get into a little bit of a longer discussion here, probably with the UDFAs. The Bills took, and you touched on it, the Bills took 2, corners in the draft, and then they obviously signed another one through UDFA. They already have a bunch on the team. So I don't want to stick with that, for too long. I want to move on to pick 209, because for as bad and as inconsistent as the offensive line was last year, they waited till pick 209 to do anything, about the offensive line. And they picked tackle Luke Tenuta with this pick. So do they have plans for the offensive line? Was it just a bad year? Did they see things that we didn't see? Because, at times it was a very bad offensive line, but you're waiting till pick 209 in a draft where every position is so deep besides quarterback, and you're waiting till now to take a tackle at a position where you have 2 really good tackles, and the issues were more at who is the future at center and what's happening at guard. So what are the Bills doing, not just with the offensive line, but with Luke Tenuta, tackle at pick 209? Because it really, honestly, not saying he's not a good talent. I don't know that much about him yet, but it seems like that was not the position of need on the offensive line. So I'm very confused as to what they're doing.
Yeah, and sure. And I went into this draft cycle as having offensive guard as my number one need for them. Certainly at the time I was like, man, they need a starter. And then even after a little while, I was like, well, they're going to need a developmental guy because Saffold's going to be gone. And then they re-signed Bates, and Butker will probably start on the pup, but then he'll be back. And then it became this thing where I didn't even want them to take any offensive lineman, because I'm like, how is the guy going to make the roster unless you're taking like a guy in the first round? And like, that seems kind of silly at this point, because you've got, Questenberry, and you've got Mance, and you've got all these guys who they signed. And it seemed to me that they said, okay, look, we're not going to really pick in the trenches this year. We're going to do other stuff. We got these needs taken care of. We've got a lot of veterans. And the Bills have said, and I must have missed this, but I did hear someone say that Brandon Beane basically said that they think that with Aaron Cromer coming in, that they're wiping the slate clean for Cody Ford. This is the first time he hasn't been injured since he's been on the team. New offensive line coach, and they're just going to wipe the slate clean and almost like start over with him. So they're not getting rid of him. It doesn't sound like it. So you've got all these guys. So you get to this point, and I feel like this is like a developmental project guy. The problem I have with it is that he's 6'8", which is usually, that's really tall. It's almost like too tall. These guys always get these back issues when they're over like 6'6" and whatever, but tall guys are supposed to be tackles. But then this guy doesn't have good lateral movement, and he has short arms. So that says, okay, well, maybe he's a guard. But then, like I said, he's almost too tall to be a guard. Because how is he going to get that leverage? So I don't really know what they're doing with this pick. Like, I get a developmental offensive lineman. I just don't know why it was this one. Because I feel like the physical traits are working at cross purposes. So I don't know like what their plan is really. Besides, and these guys are guys who you try to sneak onto the practice squad, and like we saw last year, they end up getting taken probably anyway. So yeah, the offensive line plan, I think the plan in the draft to me was just kind of weird all the way around. Like maybe this was like a Jake Fromm thing where like he really was the best guy on our board, guys, and so we just took him because we didn't know what else to do at this point. Yeah, I that's the only thing I can really think of.
Yeah. And I mean, I would understand that, but it still concerns me because we're heading into like year 5 or year 6 in total since this 2017, since this rebirth in 2017, and we're still trying to figure out the offensive line that's in front of your $258 million quarterback, and you want him to run less so that he doesn't risk injury. Okay, well now you're forcing him to stay even more behind this really bad offensive line. And it seems like, just to go back a little bit to special teams, we thought that they fixed special teams a couple years ago. Then they let Corey Bojorquez go, and now it's like you're super inconsistent at special teams. You're super inconsistent with your offensive line. What is happening? And that's the question that I want to know, because again, like you said, I get how this could be a developmental, long-term depth type guy. You might sneak him onto the practice squad. He might get taken, but it really comes down to what happens if the guy or the two guys in front of him get hurt. Like you mentioned, Cody Ford has been notoriously hurt since his time here. What happens if these guys get hurt and then this guy's not ready? He's not the type of guy that we want in there. And there's so many question marks. So, excuse me, but I don't know. It's really the one that still, as of right now, is rather confusing to me. I understand now more the Terrell Bernard pick. I
Right.
understand that more through your analysis and through looking at him after the fact. I still, like you, don't understand outside of the conventional wisdom. Like I don't see his place on the team, because then, like you mentioned, they signed a whole bunch of guys in the offseason. Let me look through here really quick. I don't know. I
It's
don't
it's
think
and
they
it's
took
weird
any.
because they've tried really hard. I feel like for the offensive line, and they just like kind of haven't been successful with it in a way. It's not like for lack of commitment to a certain amount of resources. It's
Right.
just that almost a lot of the things that they've tried haven't worked. And maybe if we really took a deep dive into every other team in the league, we'd see that that's kind of normal. But I don't have time to do that right now.
No.
It seems kind of weird, right? That like that tried to do it, but they've tried to do it, but they've tried to do it without like premium assets, right? Like the Saints are always taking offensive linemen in the first round, you know? Like the
Yeah.
Bills haven't really done that yet. So maybe that's like the disconnect. While they've signed a lot of guys and they've drafted a lot of guys, they haven't like really like committed premium assets necessarily to like the offensive lines in terms of draft picks.
No, and again, that goes back to my comment earlier of this is a draft that's so deep at every position besides quarterback. You waited till pick 209 to take any sort of offensive line help, and then when you do so, you take a tackle when the issue is
Right.
at the guard and then really at the future of center. But I wanted to look it up here really quick. I know we're going to get into it in a little bit, but they signed an undrafted free agent offensive lineman in Alec Anderson from UCLA, and that's a pretty good undrafted free agent signing. So, and I think he plays guard. It just says offensive line here, but I think he plays guard. So you waited till 209 to take a tackle. I mean, you get a pretty good signing in Alec Anderson from UCLA. It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because you've had some really good offensive linemen, specifically guards, taken in rounds 1 and 2 of the NFL draft over the last 2 or 3 years. And the Bills just have not committed to that. But speaking of that, kind of again in the same vein, with their last pick at 231, they take another linebacker in Bale Inspector. Now I got to preface this by saying, Bale Inspector sounds like one of those randomly generated characters, like when you're so far down the line in Madden, um, and you're like, "Oh, I just drafted Balen Spector, linebacker with pick 231,
Right,
and he
right.
has the same face as 70 other guys on my roster this year." Um, but yeah, so again, this is a guy who even in a draft this deep, a lot, at least for me, and I know talking to a couple others, is a name that not just in relation with the Bills, but in relation to the NFL draft, a name that not a lot of people saw popping up on a lot of mock drafts, or in their analysis. So we know that we lost some linebacker talent. We know that fans, if not the team, has some questions or clouds around Tremaine Edmonds. We know that they drafted Terrell Bernard at pick 89, but he's not really, coming in, at least right now on the surface. It doesn't look like he's coming in to replace, or fill some of these gaps and holes. So the pick at 231 with Balen Spector, what does that do for the team?
Yeah, you know, I'm not really sure. w- Right, it's another thing where we're creating competition, right? But like, at what at what level are we creating competition? Is this competition for a guy like Joe Giles Harris, who probably isn't going to make the roster and is probably just going to be on the practice squad? Like, is that the we're creating competition like for the practice squad? Like I understand, like, okay, he's been at Clemson, like he's somewhat talented, like he's an average player, right? So like I like, is this just a, hey, let's like get competition pick? Like I'm not sure, and you wonder if this is another, okay, well, this is the best guy on our board. Like sometimes I feel like the Bills are too into creating competition, and I wonder if they forsake other things, like, just to get this kind of thing in here. So I think he's a solid player. I think he's unspectacular. I don't think he's super athletic, but he did play football at Clemson, so that says something, right? But I
Right.
wonder if it was 15 years ago, if this guy's like a higher draft pick, right? Like if they're doing 4 3s and 3 4s, and there isn't all this crazy passing, if this guy's like a fourth round pick, but like in today's
Right.
NFL, he's just like a guy, he's like 6 foot, like 230. He's okay as an athlete, nothing great, like solid, won't do anything, won't make any spectacular plays, but won't really cost you. He's like a guy, like, so these are the guys where you hope that, right, they have some sort of special teams value for you, or they develop for 3 years and come in, and a guy gets hurt and they can give you something off the bench, like that type of a thing.
Right. And I mean, it's difficult because I obviously want the best for the team. And so far this team has given very little in terms of things to doubt. But if we're talking, I mean, not just Spectre, but with Tenuta, if you're talking for your last two picks at 209 and 231, if the repeating theme is like, well, they're just there to create competition, or they might develop into something solid farther down the line. I know your sixth and seventh round picks aren't really going to give you a whole heck of a lot in return, but I'd rather that you trade them. If you can turn that seventh into a sixth and that sixth into a fifth, a year, 2, 3 down the line, I'd rather that you do that, because a year, 2, 3 down the line, especially as a lot of these caps hit, a lot of these guys are looking for new contracts. We're going to talk about that in a second. There's a potential that you're going to need to take guys farther down the line that you can't take now.
Right.
And you're either taking up space or money or wasted opportunity for the future. And I get it. Bean, I believe Bean when he says that he's not trying to do like a win now thing and go all in, but every move he's made since free agency opened up has been like, we're going for it over the next couple of. He's done a really good job of not doing a win like that. Like, he's not sacrificing the team's future for this year. We're getting at least 3, maybe 4 years of Von Miller. You've signed Stephon Diggs. You've locked down Trey. You've locked down Josh. You sign great talent in Kaiir Elam, who you're going to have for 4, potentially 5 years if they give him that extension. You fix your punt game, hopefully. So they're doing he's doing these things that have set them up for this very, like, the window has gotten a lot smaller. And I really didn't realize that till we started kind of going through this, where I'm sitting here now looking and we're talking about the draft picks, and I'm like, oh wow, like this window pretty much, I would say, exists for, like, he's not the end all be all, but I'm saying, like, I'm gonna give it the tenure of Von Miller in Buffalo. Like, that's where this really big, like, win now type of window exists. You can extend it past that. Again, it depends on the financials and who you're bringing in and blah blah blah. But I think if you're scrunching the window down to this 3, maybe 4 years of, like, we need to win championships, and you're not really building towards the future, and you're sacrificing that 2-3 years down the line for Balin Spector and Luke Tenuta, I'm not really sure that I agree with that. Again, they've given us very little to doubt them, but these seem like very silly picks. Like, you just, like, it's like when you're playing Madden and you're at the end of the draft and you're like, I just want it to be over, so I'm taking Balin Spector and Luke Tenuta because I don't feel like looking at 30 or 5 more draft offers from these teams. So at least that's how it feels to me. I don't know how you feel about that, but it feels like, if you can get a 5th or a 6th, or I don't know, turn the 2 of them into a 4th or something.
Right, like, that's what I was gonna say is and maybe they tried this, we don't know, right? We're not in the room.
True.
But hey, like, couldn't you have maybe traded up, higher into the 6th round or into the 5th round with these 2 picks, or like, and I guess my bigger point too, in a way, is what I was thinking about is, this is really like an interesting sort of exercise. If you're looking at this sort of from a eye in the sky view, it's an interesting exercise in team building, because I think, like, you come in and they told the Pagulas they had a 5-year plan. Now, I don't know what the 5-year plan, like, what the end was, like, hey, we're going to be a playoff contender, like, in 5 years, or whatever. Like, a roster's always evolving, but it's interesting, right? Because they come in and McDermott goes through his first year, and then after that, Bean comes in, they get their quarterback, they get their linebacker. They're like, okay, we're going to surround this guy with all these veterans, and they don't necessarily have to be the best veterans, but they're veterans. So Josh isn't going to have to worry about the guy calling protections that, like, he's never played in the NFL. Josh doesn't have to worry about the wide receiver, like, has never understood what leverage is in the NFL. Like, we got that. And then, okay, so Josh takes a step. Let's strengthen up the defense, right? We're going to put a lot of young, early picks, right, guys, into the defense, yet surround those guys with some veterans. Okay, now we structured the contracts in a way where, so now these contracts are going to fall off when these other guys, these young guys, come up for contracts, but yet we still have to surround these guys with the veterans. So then Bean looks at the roster and goes, okay, like, what did I try to do, but I didn't do well enough? Pass rusher. Okay, what did I try to do well, but I didn't do well enough? Offensive line. So to me, it's obviously this, like, living, breathing thing, and you say, okay, well, that didn't work, how are we going to fix that? Okay, that didn't work, how are we going to fix that, right? And I think it's these little things. Like, now they're like, okay, we need a pass catching running back, like, so, like, they didn't really need one last year, they had other things to do. So to your point about the picks, it's interesting because you don't expect them to have an impact this year, but like, what's the impact next year, right? Like,
Right.
and maybe the answer is nothing. And I'm not saying, like, like, every pick's going to hit. Like, that's not reality for a variety of reasons, some of which are easily fixable, but the NFL refuses to do it. Others, which is just, you're trying to predict the future of human beings, and predicting the future of human beings is very difficult.
Yeah.
But but it's like, what are we getting out of this? Is it worth bringing these guys in to compete with a guy who's going to be on the practice squad? Like, is that really, like, that's really strengthening the bottom of your the bottom of your roster at that point, like, I'm not saying, like, there's some guy out there who I saw, I was like, oh my God, he's going to be an all-pro. I can't believe they didn't take him in the 7th round. But I agree with you that I think they could have done something differently.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you said it before. I want to say with Cook, but these do feel like luxury picks. Like it feels like, hey, we can pad the bottom of our roster because we're at such a point that we can do that. But the one thing that really kind of irks me along, and again, it's not a massive thing. Like I'm not going to demand a change in the GM or the front office or whatever, but it feels like now more so than ever before, and that might just be because this Bills team was so bad when they took over, um, and really transitioning into this new era that we find ourselves in. But it feels like we're always a year behind. Like everybody else has a pass catching running back, we need a pass catching running back. And people really tout the Bills as, I mean, us as fans, we do too. We're like, oh, we're always on the cutting edge, blah blah blah. But I think it maybe felt that way because we were building. What we have now is way better than what we had before. It's an actual built team. It's a whole team with a couple of missing, pieces to the puzzle here or there. But it just feels like now, at least to me, it feels like we're a little bit behind in some areas, and we're always trying to play catch up. And so transitioning into that, we had mentioned that we were going to talk about this a little bit ago, but the Bills did not take a safety in the draft. And I believe, just checking through here again, they didn't take a safety so far in undrafted free agency. And yeah, they haven't. They've taken defensive linemen, wide receivers, offensive linemen, defensive tackles, a running back, a corner, and a tight end. And we'll get into those in a bit. But the Bills come out of undrafted free agency and the draft without another safety. So we talked before, you had mentioned before how, we don't know if somebody like DeMar Hamlin, who looks pretty solid from when he's been on the field, but we don't know if that he's going to be a guy that's going to compete for taking over for Hyde or Poyer, when one or both of them leave. But going safety-less in the draft, is this good news on the Poyer front? And granted, we haven't heard a whole heck of a lot. There haven't been any rumblings on Twitter. There haven't been any, clashes between the fans or the parties and the camps involved. And typically not hearing anything is a good sign from the Bills organization, because it means things are getting done. But is it in your eyes an even better sign that they did not take a safety? Like, is that just because either the Bills know that something's going to get done, or was it maybe just like in a good faith gesture? Like, hey, we're not intending on replacing you. We want you to come back. Let's work through this and get to a deal that's beneficial for both of us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I think it's a good sign, and I also think that the Bills necessarily wouldn't let something like that affect their draft strategy too much. I guess like if Drew Rosenhaus was like, "Look, man, like Jordan hates you guys. he wants to go. And good luck in the draft in 3 days." Like, sure, they would probably have to, you know, at least take a guy at some point, even like if it's just for like a backup role, and say, hey, you know what, we're rolling with Jaquan Johnson, but we need a backup now. So I think it's a good sign. And the thing that I've always been one of the things that I've always been really impressed with Brandon Beane is he just seems like he's just a nice guy, and he's really like relaxed, and he's and I think he even said he said my main goal is to be honest, like be honest with the players, be honest with the agents, like, hey man, we love your client but we can't re-sign him, like I'm sorry. Or hey, we love your client, we know he wants to get paid, we'll get to it. Now, my understanding from his limited public comments is that he said, look, we got the draft, we understand your request. Once the draft's done, we'll talk again. And I just think that he's just upfront like that. Like he probably understands Jordan Poyer. Like Jordan Poyer's making what, 7-8 million bucks, and he see all these safeties making 19 million all of a sudden. So of course you're gonna be like, hey, I was an all pro. This guy wasn't an all pro. I want my salary to be commensurate. And of course you do. Like anybody would, right? Like that's just sort of like this basic human thing. And I think Brandon Beane is so aware of just building good relationships with people and keeping those relationships and still maintaining a business. If they can't sign Poyer, they'll tell him. They'll be like, "Hey, man, like no offense, we love you, but we got this guy coming up and this guy." And he alluded to that too. He said, "Look, there's players who have come to me, whose agents have come to me, and they didn't say it in the media, but Jordan Poyer isn't the only guy's agent who said, "Hey, man, my guy's gonna need a contract extension." Like Brandon Bean knows. He knows who's up. Dawson Knox is up. We talked about it. Singletary's up. We talked about Edmonds. No one really knows what Edmonds wants, right? But he's up for an extension. Like it's possible to do an extension with him at this point. So it isn't just Poyer. So he's very friendly. He's very professional, but he's the guy who has to make this all fit financially. So I think it's good news, and I think they also realize they've got Poyer on contract for a year. Now,
Right.
if he's really unhappy, could he sit out? Sure. So you don't want that to happen, but I think as long as the lines of communication are open and honest, only good things will happen.
All right. All right. I like it. And I mean, we know Drew Rosenhaus's reputation. He's, literally the best agent, if not one of the best in the league. He's a fantastic negotiator. He represents tons of the biggest stars. And I agree. I mean, Poyer absolutely deserves his money. It's going to come down to, this is what a lot of people in, the Twitterverse don't understand. It's going to come down to, can we afford him financially? And I mean, there's other factors too, right? Like he is getting up there in age. There are younger guys on this team that we referenced before, Jaquan Johnson, DeMar Hamlin. There are younger guys who could be vying for these spots. They could be eyeing somebody a year or two down the road in the draft. They could be eyeing somebody who's currently in the NFL, who's not on this team that they might want to trade for in a couple of years. We don't know because, as you mentioned before, we're not in the room. So we're going to see how it happens. I mean, it's not, I don't think anybody's against bringing Jordan Poyer back. Like he had one of, if not his best season last year. He was an absolute stud. And as you mentioned, he's an all pro, but kind of going along the same lines of that, I wanted to turn the discussion now to, we've gone through the draft. We're going to go through the undrafted free agents next and talk about some of them, not all of them. But I want to know who beats out who, because as we've talked about, has kind of been the theme tonight. This is such a good team. And this is a team that is financially locked in on multiple players. Like Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs alone account for 30% of the cap. So this team is largely locked in at a lot of, even at some depth positions. Again, like you had mentioned before, like Dane Jackson, like he might even be locked in at a depth position. We got to see how he plays, or what happens in this preseason. But with them not trading away those picks at 209 and 231, they add two more people who are probably on the canyon's edge of the abyss that is the NFL. And especially this year, the AFC. So is there anybody on here on this list of the draft picks for 2022 that have to like compete for a spot? Like obviously I don't think Kaiir Elam is going to be in this discussion. He's probably got number 2 locked down, if not starting over Dane Jackson in place of Trey. So maybe Kaiir Elam's not part of this, but like Terrell Bernard, James Cook, Khalil Shakir, Christian Benford, probably not Matt Araiza, because he's got to be better than Matt Hawk, right? Knock on wood. So of these guys, do you have them beating out a veteran that's currently on the team? Or do you think that most of this draft class is going to be like depth or practice squad, or just not even making the right. roster? So you don't got to go through everybody, but like, who's a couple people that stand out?
Right. And I think that's an interesting question, because I think the first 6 guys, the first 6 guys will all make the roster. So, and I was just going through that in my head, right? Like who puts a veteran we're used to seeing on the roster off the roster? And I'm not sure if there's, I guess you could say Bernard might make a guy like Andre Smith or Tyler Medikevich expendable. And that might be a little bit more of a money thing and obviously a special
Right.
teams thing. I think Benford is certainly in a competition. I don't think like the Bills never give anybody anything, but like Elam's
Right.
going to be on the roster. Like, let's be honest, and I think Benford's going to make it, but I think he's going to have to compete, like hell to do it. I think that's going to be a spirited competition. I think Shakir's going to be in a spirited competition with Stevenson and some of the other guys like a Tanner Gentry, whatever. And I think Cook is in a bit of a competition with Duke Johnson. Now, don't get me wrong; they're not going to cut their second round pick, but in terms of playing time, right? Like that's an
Right.
interesting battle too. Moss, Johnson, Cook. I think that's interesting. Like Bernard versus Arthur Smith and Metakevich. So certainly there is room for a veteran or two to be displaced, but I think there's also room for those six guys to kind of make it and not displace a veteran either. And I know that sounds like a bit two sided there, but I do expect those six guys to make it. But there's going to be some spirited competitions for sure.
So you don't think like Balin Spector is going to be,
I
he's
mean,
not,
I'd be
starting at
surprised.
linebacker?
Like, I don't want to count him out.
Right.
I don't know the guy. I haven't watched all the games, so I don't want to count him out just because of where he was picked. But it seems unlikely to me. Like there's like a 2% chance that, in my mind, that he makes the roster.
All right. All right. I like it. So, just really quick before we head into the last topic of discussion for this evening, I want to thank everybody who's commented. I want to thank everybody behind the screen that's here listening to us talk. I promise this hour and probably a half that this is going to go has been absolutely worth it. I just want to thank you all again. Our follows on Twitter are down below. Not all of Charlie's because there's like 100 of them. So you can account hop. Just go to the bio and start clicking on the accounts. You'll find all of them, I promise. And there's really great. I mean, I won't speak on it. You can speak on it if you want to, but you are doing some like massive obviously analytics based projects where you're taking not just a team or two or a couple of years, you're taking the entire NFL and you're doing decades worth of data and compiling it and putting it together and then taking it and going even deeper and comparing it. So like you're doing all of this really cool stuff. So if anybody's interested in following Charlie for that or his 100 Twitter accounts, you can definitely go ahead and do that. And Charlie, if you want to get into it a little bit before we head into the undrafted free agents, you certainly can.
Yeah, sure. I'll give a quick synopsis. So two quick things before I get into what you're talking about. I do have a new quarterback completion percentage metric called competitive completion percentage. It sort of falls in between regular and adjusted for those of you who are completion percentage aficionados who are wondering what the difference is. I will have player grades also this year. I did them last year and it was extremely difficult, so I totally redid the way I do them, so it's easier for me and it doesn't take literally like 28 hours of math each week to do that. But the main thing that I have been working on for about 3 years now is something called draft value score. And what that does is it does two things. It allows us to know who is a hit or a miss based on the grading scales that you guys will see, like 1 through 10 with draft picks. It's a similar scale like that. The other thing it allows us to do is it allows us to figure out what type of value a team has gotten out of a player. For instance, Josh Allen has he returned first round value yet? Has he returned third round value? So what I'm doing is I'm compiling everything from now until 1980, back that far eventually. So I'll be able to compare every organization in terms of their hit rate, in terms of value returned on a per round basis, on a total year basis. I'll be able to do it year by year. I'll even be able to tell people hit rates, defensive tackles taken in the fourth round by the Buffalo Bills, what the hit rate is for that, quarterbacks taken in the third round, all that stuff. We're going to round by round, position by position, franchise by franchise. It's going to be like that in depth. It's going to have that many layers to it eventually. So look out for that. um, once I've done, maybe 6, 7 years of it so far, so I've only got about 30 years to go. But
Nice.
that's what we're working on.
Nice. Nice. And there's going to be, especially like when we get into the draft next year and we're starting to talk about these types of things, and we're doing these team analyses, that's going to be ultra important. Now, you know me, I'm super bad at math, and so I understand very little of what this stuff is, but you do a really good job of breaking it down to a level that somebody like me who is not, predisposed to this type of knowledge can understand. So I appreciate that. And on behalf of all others who are, um, you know, math, challenged, we appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I sometimes I think that I'm sort of math challenged as well. I must admit I didn't love math when I was in school. Also, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, Ryan, but I also plan on doing full scouting reports for this upcoming
Yes.
2023 draft. I'm hoping to do about 260-ish players. So look out for that as well. At some point I'm actually going to start watching film this weekend. I think
Nice.
we'll see. And for those people who are super enthralled with the draft, there might be as many as 8 quarterbacks taken in the first round next year. Like,
Wow.
yeah, Mel Kiper set the over under at 6.5.
Wow.
So just for those
That's,
people out there who are interested.
well, definitely a different theme next year compared to this last year.
Yeah, for sure.
But heading back into this final thing, and again, thank you everyone for watching this week's episode of the Rust Belt Report. I appreciate it. If you want to go ahead and give us a follow and a like, both here on Buffalo Fan Base and wherever you're watching it from, and again, our personal Twitters down at the bottom. But we wanted to talk about the undrafted free agent signings, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I'm not really sure, especially when we do stuff like this in the content creation community. Not a whole lot of people talk about the UDFAs. They don't talk about the guy, the veterans that are really signed afterwards, unless they're like a big name, guy. But I wanted to take a moment and talk about this, especially because this Bills team and this front office is really good at finding guys who are undrafted free agents who can take away starting spots from veterans. And we saw that happen with Levi Wallace, who's obviously now no longer with the Bills. He's in Pittsburgh. But they have some really good, and again, this was a very deep year for the draft, but they have some really good, really well-known names so far on their undrafted free agency list. So I'm going to run through them really quick, and then we'll talk about them. But and again, I do want to preface this: we're using a Bills Wire article. So if it's not completely up to date, somebody just drop another name in the comments. But we're looking at tight end Jalen Weidermeyer from Texas A&M. We're looking at cornerback Trayvon Fuller from Tulsa, running back Raheem Blackshear from Virginia Tech, defensive tackle Prince Emili from Penn. We are looking at offensive lineman Alex Anderson from UCLA, defensive lineman Kingsley Jonathan from Syracuse, wide receiver Neil Pau from BYU, and that's it. So you get a pretty good swath of different positions there, both offensively and defensively. And there's some really good names in there. So Charlie, starting with you, is there one name that really pops out to you that would fall under the good part of this, that you're like, hey, I'm really glad we got this guy. This was a steal for, undrafted free agency. They could potentially be something.
Yeah, I really actually like what I've sort of been able to, I guess, discover about Alec Anderson a little bit. He's a guy who played at UCLA offensive line, and he's gone up against obviously Kayvon Thibodeau, and I think undrafted free agents is weird because I've heard stuff about how like certain agents will campaign when you get to the 6th and 7th round for like a guy of theirs to not get taken because they want that guy to have the freedom to pick where he wants to go. So I think looking at these guys in a light as like, oh well, where you weren't even good enough to get drafted. First of all, that isn't always like the case in a way, and it sounds weird. It's like, why would teams do that for an agent? But for whatever reason, they do. And I don't mean to give you a little hope here at the end, Ryan, but maybe this is your developmental offensive lineman. You're right. Teams seem to find these guys, these undrafted free agents, who always kind of stick around. They work hard, they develop, and so I just like the idea of taking this guy who's played against a premier pass rusher in a pretty good college football conference. I really like that. And I will say the other thing that I was really sort of interested in as well is there's a lot of ties to the Buffalo area also, like, and one thing about Weidermeyer, I know everyone's like super excited. I did manage to watch a little bit of him, and to me, he looks like he's running in concrete. So I understand that he's athletic to a point, but I'm not sure that I'm as excited about him as other people are. But I think it's interesting that there's a guy from Syracuse. They even signed a guy, not a UDFA, but they got a guy from Buff State, a tryout. Like, that's just like cool to me. And maybe it's just sort of
Yeah.
eye candy for the community, but I really think it's neat. Same thing with UB. They got a guy from UB for a tryout. I just think that that's cool that they want to do that. I also know that one of the guys, and it might be Alec Anderson himself, has a connection to the Bills because his uncle or cousin is the Bills assistant special teams coach. So there's
Okay.
that connection there. But I think that's really cool that the Bills are willing to give guys from the local schools and finger quotes a little bit a chance. I really like that.
Okay. Okay. Um, and I still have it on the docket. I'm hoping to get it done, but I do have um a high school football player who committed to Syracuse from that actually went to the same high school that I went to that I'm gonna hopefully still be able to sit down and interview. We just haven't been able to line our schedules up yet. But
That's really cool.
um and but to your point, there's a ton of guys. Go all the way back to Khalil Mack being at UB and having the opportunity to take him and then not. We've had like two opportunities through either trade or free agency to take somebody like that. And I did, when you brought up Alec Anderson, I was like, his name sounds so familiar for some reason. And I don't know why. That is probably it because of his Buffalo connection. Um, but so a little bit of my thing, and then I'll kind of turn it back over to you to go. Well, you already went into it, but I was gonna say Jalen Weidermeyer just simply because of the fact that when I ran through and I did my mock draft and I looked at the team's needs this year, I had a couple positions that I like flipped back and forth on where I'm like, I like if they can take a tight end, I want them to take a tight end. If they can take a safety, like I want them to take a safety because you don't know. And those were
Right.
two positions where you're looking for depth. Obviously, we have OJ Howard and Dawson Knox at tight end. We talked about Jaquan Johnson and DeMar Hamlin at safety, but the uncertainty with Poyer, tight end outside Howard and Knox is fairly unreliable. So I was kind of in on Jalen Weidermeyer. Now hearing that it looks like he runs with cement blocks on his feet is not something that I like to hear because even though Dawson Knox and OJ Howard are big guys, they're pretty fast, or they can at least, gain a lot of yards. They're pretty strong. But the one that I really like, so my good is Prince Emili, the defensive tackle from Penn football. Like he's such a hard hitting guy. He makes plays. Like he's a solid guy. Now I don't think he's going to take anybody's starting job, especially because we look at who our defensive tackles are. I don't think he's replacing any of our veterans.
Right.
But he's a solid add to defensive tackle. And especially when you bring in a new guy like Tim Settle at that position too, you want to bring in some competition. And I know we talked about that, but you want to bring in somebody like this who's new. Like it feels like a very good fit to me. So Prince Emili is my pick for the good. So, do you have somebody for the bad before we get to the ugly?
Yeah, and I guess I'll pick on Jalen Weidemeyer some more. And it's weird. It's just weird because he is like athletic, right? And he does like make plays, and he it's just that like you watch him and you're like what's going on? Like you're running in quicksand. It's weird. It's weird that you would be athletic sort of in your upper body, but not in the lower part of your body. It's just an odd thing. But I agree with you that if they are going to run more 12 personnel, they're going to need more tight ends, whether that's maybe not on the active roster necessarily, but on the practice squad or guys that they've at least had into training camp. So I'm totally fine with bringing a guy like that in. It's just a weird evaluation when you watch him and you say, "Oh, that was really good," and then you're like, "But man, like it's just weird to watch that happen where the lower body's like kind of doing one thing and then the upper body is like much better at what it's supposed to be doing."
Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking up some of these guys here. Um, no, it's and the problem we talked about this on the live stream is like speed is the one thing that can't be taught. And so like if it looks like he's running in quicksand, like it might just be like you just kind of described. It might just be a mechanics thing, and you just have to teach him, which is silly as it sounds. You might just have to teach him how to run better. But that's also like that's an extremely weird and difficult thing to be teaching somebody who's in their early 20s, their early to mid 20s. So for me, my bad, which isn't really that bad, but it's really more of a combination of where he's coming from, plus the depth that already exists on this team that we talked about. But Neil Pau, and I apologize, I'm probably not pronouncing his last name correctly, from Brigham Young University. You're already coming from BYU, which is not, that much. I mean, it's a football school. Like they have, a good team, but they're more so known for their dramatics, their flair that they do with their games. They've had some really good recruits come out of there that have turned into some really good players, but it really comes down to this team is already so stacked at wide receiver. Like it's an undrafted free agency signing. Like this is a camp body, maybe a practice squad guy. Because obviously, they've expanded the practice squad, so you can throw a couple of extra guys on there, but it doesn't feel like a guy who's long for Buffalo. So that's my bad, not my bad, but that's my pick for the bad for this. Do you have an ugly?
uh hmm do I have an ugly? You know what? I don't know if I have an ugly. I don't want to pick on the same guy again.
Oh my God. He just like qualifies for the last two.
Well, I guess I'll say I'm kind of surprised that they didn't really sign a lot of guys. And I understand like when you're the Bills and you've got like 4 or 5 spots on your roster, you're not going to get a lot of UDFAs that want to right
Yeah.
come to you because like there's not a lot of spots. But still it's weird that there's like 6 guys. Like that is sort of weird to me. I think they're at 85 now, which leaves 5 spots available. So I'm sure they have a plan, but that's just kind of weird to me in general. Like at the same thing is like, wouldn't it in a way, wouldn't it be like easier, right?
Mhm.
Because like, hey, come play for the Buffalo Bills. Like, you don't want to go to the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, necessarily like
Yeah.
you want to. So I think that that's just a weird part of this sort of UDFA thing that there aren't a lot of them.
Yeah. I do have one for the ugly. And I probably could have used him for the bad as well. But Raheem Blackshear. And again, it's not really the ugly, but it kind of is. So running back Raheem Blackshear came out of Virginia Tech. He averaged almost 6 yards a carry in 2021. So you're really not getting anything out of this UDFA signing that you're not already getting out of the running backs that are on your team. You obviously drafted one you traded back 6, but you drafted one at 63 in James Cook. Virginia Tech is Virginia Tech. It has, it's it's not Clemson, it's not LSU, but it is Virginia Tech. So it has a rather good football program, but he didn't see the ball a whole heck of a lot, and he's averaging pretty much what everybody else on your team is already averaging. Granted, a lot of that issue might have to, or is definitely coming from the fact that you have an inconsistent offensive line, but you put 5.7 yards per carry behind this offensive line, and you're probably going to get no production out of them. Like it feels like you said, it feels a lot of these, the fact that there are a lot of signings feels weird. Some of these signings definitely feel off, like the wide receivers, the running backs, because there's so many, or you're not really getting anything more than you already have. So that's the only reason I'm saying that Blackshear is the ugly, because if he's averaging in college what your NFL running backs are averaging, the law of averages is suggesting that he's going to get even less in the NFL.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're
And
saying.
so I don't really get it. I mean, maybe it's just a signing. Maybe it goes back to, hey, we're just bringing in competition, but I don't really know how much Raheem Blackshear is going to be competent. Now, listen, he could absolutely walk in there and steal the starting job. Who knows? Probably not.
Right.
Probably not. But there's always that 1% possibility. So that's my good, the bad, the ugly.
All right. Well, there we go. Like we picked on Jalen Weidemeyer a
Who is we?
little.
Who is we? Let's make
Oh,
that very
okay,
clear.
that's fair.
It was you.
Yeah, I did. Sorry to all the people who love him.
I mean, there's nobody. Well, so there's one, John Osborne, in the comments saying that Weidemeyer was sick at combine and has play speed rated second early on. So, I mean, we'll see. I mean, the depth at tight end is wide open,
Right.
especially if one of these guys gets injured. And we know that we're going to be running the 2 tight end set this year. If one of these guys goes down, we'll be able to. Now, granted, he has to make the team, but we'll never. We don't know, because Tommy Sweeney is definitely not the answer at tight end. We found that out last year. But I just want to, Charlie, I want to thank you for doing this again. It was a short turnaround. I mean, I got to tell you, man, I asked literally everyone, all the content creators I know, reporters, journalists, and everybody was busy today. Like, everybody's like, I'm either going to see an early play of Doctor Strange, or I'm doing, or like whatever. And I'm like, I get it, but this is just extremely, like, I'm spending all, like, from yesterday through today, I'm texting so many people. And so, that's not, I'm not going to say who they are, because it's not like it's a bad thing. I get it. People are busy, but I wanted to let you know that I appreciate the fact that you came on and saved the listeners from having to listen to me talk for an hour and 40 minutes by myself.
No, I appreciate the invite. I appreciate you
Of
having me
course.
on. I always enjoy working with the group you guys have over here. Um, so yeah, I'm always excited to come on when I can.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. And you will definitely be on again in the future. So with that, thank you everybody for watching this week's episode of the Rust Belt Report here on Buffalo Fan Base. I believe that we will be back next week. I don't see any reason as to why not. Happy Cinco de Mayo to those that celebrate today. And next week will be
You will
right
be
before.
on schedule release night
Oh, wow. Really? All right.
next.
So
Yeah, it's the 12th, right? So yeah, it'll be.
wow. Okay. So we might have to do a special. We might have to do a special episode for schedule release night. Let's see. So and then it's right before Mother's Day as well. So if you are unable to watch next week, happy Mother's Day to any of the mothers that are out there watching. But that has been this week's episode of the Rust Belt Report. And we have some awesome things that we're hoping to bring to you guys. So thank you so much for supporting. And just remember, at the end of the day, go Bills.
Go Bills.